But welcome all, and a pleasure to have you all. And the way the panel is technically is about a introduction of the book. A book that I have to say came in a rather complicated period of our lives. The authors, for those the people who actually sit down and put the articles, the editors, which is after the collapse of Afghanistan. And I think I'll let Anna talk about it more, but it came in a time in which we had no idea what we were going to think about, how we had to imagine ourselves, where we were standing. And in that very kind of a very confusing moment, some of us got together. I mean, Anna specifically, Anna and my colleagues sort of initiated that. And then all the young Afghan scholars, they get together and start writing about this, their own experience, their own kind of the fruit of their own education, and move on to their ideas and hopes about what is Afghanistan, where we're standing, and try to explain different parts of Afghanistan, what power means in Afghanistan, what authority means in Afghanistan, and specifically how the new generation of scholars of Afghanistan can kind of think about all these things. And the book was very important to me, at least personally, because I thought everything was lost after 2021. But the work that happened, I realized actually it's premature for me to think like that. There's a generation emerged in that last 20 years allows us to think, actually gives us a voice to actually, for the first time in many, many years, our generation come back and actually say and think about how we imagine Afghanistan and how we define different aspects of it. So this book is actually, it took a long time, a lot of work, and thanks to the co-authors, Anna Lawson and Nicole Collier, and also to the authors who wrote that. Today, to kind of sit down together and editing every paper and every word. And then the major problem was what will be the cover of this book. So we discussed a lot of that. And then we thought that the AIS actually launched a wonderful program once upon a time, which was about the Timurid or the art of Besart in Afghanistan. And we thought like nothing could capture the renaissance of Afghanistan the last 20 years, especially for us, our generation, who had the opportunity to talk, to actually bring back the school of Herat and how they, in that period, imagined themselves and how they actually reinvented art, philosophy, and thinking that later shaped the course of the history of the region. So the way I'm thinking about this whole program, I mean, is that the presenters of today are Dr. Omar Sadr, who's currently at the University of Pittsburgh, and he's going to present his, I will ask everybody to introduce themselves in details, or introduce themselves not in so details. We're supposed to have Nasima Zirak and Munazet Tekar, but due to certain problems, unfortunately had to cancel their participation at the very last moment. So we have two of our authors in this book, Omar Sadr and Mujib Obed from University of Melbourne. The way that the book is, I ask Anna Lawson first to introduce herself and also give an introduction of what is this book about and the way that the topics it covers. And then we can go to each of the, and maybe perhaps in 10 minutes max. And then each of the authors, Omar Sadr and Mujib Obed, will present their own papers in about 10 minutes. And after that, then we can go for a Q&A and a conversation about the book and about the ideas that's presented in this book. I think it's one of the first published collective efforts by the Afghan and international scholars. We have papers from very renowned and established scholars, Dr. Shahani, and everybody else, but also the new emerging scholars of Afghanistan. So, and then after that, we can have a Q&A with all authors, so some of them will here, and also from the participants. And so each one about 10 minutes. Anna, I think the chair is yours, the mic is yours. Please go ahead.
The first book post 2021.
The first book in post 2021, correct. Thank you. Came out. And so, Anna, it's your time. I think you're mute.
She's unmuted.
We can't hear you. For some reason, we can't hear you. Maybe it's about the microphone headphone you have, perhaps.
Have that. Is that better?
No.
But you have to unplug it.
Unplug it.
Can you hear me now?
Back from the computer and then see if it works.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Now we can, yeah.
Yes.
Now there's a problem.
Okay, great. I'll go ahead. So first of all, it is a great privilege to be here. Thank you, Omar, for the introduction, but also just as you were speaking then, it sort of is quite emotional for me to hear that that introduction to the book, because it was such a labor of love, and it just came at such a moment of struggle for so many people. And I think it actually was quite cathartic for a lot of us to work on it over the last 4 or 5 years, because it helped us to try to think about and process what was going on in Afghanistan. And so, yeah, we're very proud of it, and also just really grateful to be able to share it today with all of you esteemed scholars of Afghanistan. It's amazing to see how many of you are here, and yeah, I feel very, very privileged to be here in front of you today. So just a little bit about the book and how it came about. You may have heard this from a podcast, Negotiating Ideas. I was interviewed very kindly by Omar Sada, who's here, I think, and we talked about this a little bit. And I was approached to review a book proposal for a handbook for Afghanistan. And it was supposed to be a handbook of modern Afghanistan, and it had all of the proposed chapters outlined. And when I read it, I just thought, oh no, not again. Like it seemed to be very old-fashioned, if you like, in its approach. A lot of sort of analysis from a military perspective. Nothing wrong with a military analysis, of course, of what's going on in Afghanistan, but that's only part of the story. And the named chapter authors were esteemed folks who've been talking, and talking on and analyzing Afghanistan for a long time, and their work is amazing. But there were so many gaps, and there were so many people who were not represented, and so many Afghan scholars who weren't there on the list. And I said as much in my review of this proposal, and then was surprised to be asked to then come up with an alternative. So then I thought, well, why not? Let's try and see what we can come up with to fill this gap, because there's so much potential for a project like this. And this was before 2021 happened. And then the question was, okay, now what? The scope was huge. How to then try to put something together coherently that was also representative of so many different voices and scholars. And so I turned to my esteemed friends and colleagues, Dipali and Omar, for a brainstorming session of what we could do with this. And the project sort of took off from there, really. And it was fantastic to collaborate with Omar and Dipali, because their networks are so huge. Also, they had so much access to so many Afghan scholars, and also, of course, their own work is so very valuable in the field. So I feel really grateful to have been able to work with these guys in editing the project. Anyway, so we had this opportunity, and I was coming up with all kinds of ideas for frameworks and how to come at it from a historical institutionalist perspective or a feminist perspective, and all the things or focus on elections, which is what I'm interested in. But I think Dipali very wisely said, well, hang on a minute, let's keep things broad to begin with and not prescribe things from the start, and then see what comes out of a broad call for papers. So we decided to take up this very broad theme of power and authority, because these were, now that 2021 had started to happen, these were big questions. What does this takeover mean? Who has power? Who has authority in Afghanistan? Where is this going? How to even make sense of this? And then we thought, well, rather than try to predefine those terms, we would just put out a call for papers and ask anybody from any discipline, any Afghan scholar who had completed fieldwork in Afghanistan during the Third Republic, to submit papers, and we'd just see what came back. And I'm so glad we did it this way, because what we have ended up with is a multidisciplinary volume full of approaches to power and authority from so many different perspectives. So we have, religious scholars, we have political scientists, we have historical institutionalists as well, which I was pleased about. But we also have gender studies specialists. We have anthropologists, a whole mix. And I think that together, those approaches are a great strength of the volume, because they can show us exactly how, like, they can point to the depth of the ways in which authority can be construed. So what did the book end up being about? And I say end up being about because, as I said, it's quite an organic process to starting it. Well, it's really about analysing the relationship between those who govern in Afghanistan and the people that they govern. And it's about ruler and ruled, and trying to pick apart how those relationships form. And in sort of setting these parameters, we are then hoping to provide some insight into what's happening now, but also what might happen in the future in terms of governance in Afghanistan and those relationships and how they're changing. It's different as a volume because, as somebody's pointed out, it's one of the first post-intervention volumes. So we're looking retrospectively at the international intervention in the Third Republic. But we're not only looking at that period, we look historically as well. But it's new in that it has this retrospective perspective. It's new in that it showcases Afghan and young Afghan scholars and puts their work forward as the central chapters. But it also has those in conversation with chapters that we think have been seminal in the analysis of Afghan politics over the years, and also reflections from those who have come before and who have a really long-term view of politics and power and authority in Afghanistan. So it's new in that it has that sort of interesting structure, a mix of chapters and reflections and new research. It also combines empirical research with theory. Some of the chapters are very theoretical, as you'll hear about later today, and some are based on personal experience. And so that sort of mix as well provides a very rich approach to analysing power and authority. And so I think the book represents something that is novel and something that is contributing to the literature. Again, as I said before, it was a labour of love, and I am so grateful to all of the chapter authors who put so much time and effort into their chapters in such a period of upheaval and personal struggle. So on that, I'm going to stop talking and hand over to, I think it's Mujib is next.
Yeah. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Anna. I think following, it's kind of difficult for me sometimes to moderate a channel in presence of my own starts. You know, I have my own starts, so something make it difficult for me. But with that said, I think we're going to go with the presentations with the authors following the agenda in front of me. I would like to start with Omar Saad. Saad, if you can please introduce yourself a little bit about your background, and then talk about your paper.
We are not going to Mujib.
I think I'm following the things. If you want, we can start with Mujib too. And Sabat. Mujib, is it okay if we start with Omar Sadr or? All right.
All right.
Yes, please go ahead.
Sure. As the saying goes in Farsi by Jose Ustada of Yoruba, pleasure to be amongst all of you, and thanks for joining us, those who are in Afghanistan and online. Well, this paper it's part of a larger project that I am interested as a political theory scholar on liberation and pluralism. And the basic question that I try to argue here is how democracy failed in the country. So this is not changing. Okay. Some of the key arguments that I put forward in this paper is that so many people came up with arguments that why democracy failed, why the republic failed, and the Taliban took over. So I do argue here that failure of democracy was because of lack of an accommodative system, which should have mediated different moral disagreements in the country. We did have contentions over moral and cultural issues, which reflected them. All of those reflected in public sphere. But the political system and the way the philosophy behind democracy in Afghanistan did not pave the way for certain form of peaceful coexistence amongst those moral disagreements. So in that case, I try to develop a theory of holistic democracy. What I do is first I do review some of the literature on deliberative democracy, who do argue not in context of Afghanistan, but in Western context, how deliberative democracy vis-a-vis the representative democracy present an institutional framework which should address the crisis of democracy that we do observe across the world. And then the second strand of literature are the critical democrats, Chantemouve, a French Bulgarian theorist, who suggests that we do have certain form of moral differences that by anyhow they may not be resolvable. So what we have to do is to just accept those disagreements. And why that's so? Because of two factors. First of all, there might be power dynamics and political and social sphere. And those power dynamics are emerging either from political economy or ethnic or gender issues. And that's why everyone may not have full access and equal access to public sphere. So in the state, this theory suggests a framework which is called agonistic pluralism and decentered public sphere. So when you bring in the larger tensions at the capital or at national level, bring it down to the local and community and enabling people to resolve those disputes at very local level. Now, literature on why democracy fails. So post Donald Trump, the first term, a lot of political scientists explore this, why democracies fail, and that this literature is sometimes called democratic backsliding, where established liberal democracies, where they had institutions like judiciary and the free media, but all of a sudden things were falling apart. So the question was, why is so? But in case of Afghanistan, to a large extent, we cannot borrow those literature because Afghanistan, at the end of the day, it was not a well-established liberal democracy. And instead, what the literature which probably is reading well for Afghanistan is those which are bringing both conflict and democracy together. And there's an extensive literature on that, where which says that there might be cases, and there are cases where democratization and violent conflicts goes parallel and to hand together, but it brings tensions. That tensions may be over prioritization of order versus freedom and rights, or for example, whether we should prioritize democracy building or stabilization efforts. And finally, also about certain forms of democratic arrangement in terms of elections, that we all observe all of these in case of Afghanistan. Now, in my previous writings, I have argued that we do need to recognize moral and cultural differences in a pluralistic society, but that's not enough. Recognition is not ever enough. And one has to go beyond that and provide the possibility for an open, respectful, deliberative atmosphere where people should go beyond their groups and engage in a conversation and dialogue with the rest. And now, so that's why, putting in that context, I do ask this question: how did contentious disagreement, including moral conflicts, led to failure of democratic order and public sphere in Afghanistan? Now, more mainstream literature now, when they address why democracy failed in Afghanistan, they say Afghanistan failed because it was not enough democracy. And so there's a logic behind that, because democracy does aggregate preferences of individuals through elections. And since elections were rigged and Afghanistan was not enough democracy based on this perspective, that's why it failed. On the other hand, we have this deliberative democracy perspective, which says that decline of democracy should be analyzed through the lens of trust and legitimacy. When the people do not trust in institutions, that, for example, we observe now in the US, there's no trust on court system, even academia, the media, whatever you name in public sphere. And lack of trust is because the way things are polarized. Things are polarized, and that's what we political scientists call it affective polarization, where you do not pay attention to the substance and content of the other side's message, and instead you pick certain things and integrate as versus them. So that's why these scholars argue that even in conflictual and divided society like Afghanistan, deliberative frameworks may address and probably provide certain form of transformative rule to overcome those divisions. However, what we have to also be cautious that deliberation does not happen overnight, and it's not an easy task to just put people together and they will resolve all issues. There might be inequality and differing dimensions, and those may not be resolved through rational deliberation. So how do we do that one? Now, in the case of Afghanistan, definitely we are culturally diverse, meaning that people do follow different values and ways of life. Afghanistan is also segmented in a way that there are racial hierarchies, or as a gender apartheid society, it's now also a gendered society. And finally, Afghanistan is also polarized in terms of which fundamental values should shape the politics. We do not agree on those fundamental values. Name it democracy, human rights, and liberal values. These were not, we should not take it for granted. The last 20 years also, there was lots of debates. Now, what are certain form of exclusions which happened and the people could not participate in an egalitarian certain form of public sphere? Now, the first one is ethnic and gender inequality. But Afghanistan's political system was designed in a way that political power should be distributed across ethnic lines. One ethnic line on top, the others on the bottom, and some others were completely excluded. On top of that, the political economy of war and intervention by the United States also provided a certain form of inequalities where some of the elites had the opportunity to boost their wealth and their access to power through contracts and access to international troops. And finally, the strong men, or what some people may refer them as warlords, they not only boosted their wealth, but they also tried to shape public debates to establishing their own media outlets and influencing civil society. So most of the civil society were somehow, they were linked to some of these guys, and they were literally functioning like companies or consultancies rather than being proper part of voluntary civic institutions. Afghanistan was also polarized in a way, and that polarization was around identity issues, particularly ethnicity, and that intensified in the latest phases when Ashraf Ghani government tried to manipulate and play with ethnicity in a way that they tried to formalize these categories as a part of state policy. A list of, for example, ethnic groups were developed, and in a country which all resources are distributed based on identity groups. So every small segment of society tried to claim to be a separate ethnic or tribal identity in order to claim resources, as resources were distributed based on that. And finally, over shared values. So if you look at this spectrum of starting from militant Islamists and ending with militant secularists, so Afghanistan had all of these groups like the Taliban or ISPP could be categorized as those of militant Islamists. And then you have radical Islamists like Islam, for example, Hizb ut-Tahrir. They were not militant, but they were propagating very, very radical ideas. And then you have conservative Islamists, for example, the National Clergy Council, Shura Ulama Afghanistan, officially part of the state, but pushing for a certain form of conservative politics. Now, the manifestation of all of those value contentions, what we see is over a couple of examples that I will outline here. But at the same time, these examples also reflect or provided chance for the people to create certain form of counter publics, push back against certain form of hegemonic and homogenization policies of the state. First one was media outlets. For example, in one case, in 2011, President Karzai, under pressure of the Clergy Council, sent a letter to Hashd and Telonius asking them to refrain from broadcasting anything which is contrary to Islam and the national interest of the state. While these two outlets were publishing certain reports with documented human rights violations. Similarly, Click Group in 2011 published a long list and I think broadcasted 130 episodes of documentary which documented war crimes in Afghanistan. And so a group of warlords came and pushed back against pulling these media outlets down. What happened that these media outlets push back and say that there's nothing against Islam or the national interest or national security of the state. Second one is the woman counter public. The one example is in One TV, television, they broadcasted a program which was called Niqab. The Niqab provided women who were
The mask.
the mask, yes. Those who were experiencing domestic violence, but they were not able to express their identity or narrate their history due to certain forms of discrimination that they may have faced in a conservative society. So they were wearing a niqab, but and the media outlets, which was broadcasted nationally, they were narrating all of these stories, and that has somehow impacted and transformed society. Art and graffiti. One example is, which was closer to our experience, in American University of Afghanistan, which was covered by these blast walls. ART, which was one of these companies or civil society institutions which were promoting some of these civic values through art. They painted in 2018 a giant portrait of Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, which was then negotiating a deal with the government and labeling it as Butcher of Kabul. So then overnight, the government ordered some people that this should be wiped out because that somehow undermined the offshore peace process. And since the people who were involved in the graffiti, some of them were students in American University of Afghanistan, and the painting was on the walls of the university. So the university also became involved and tried to suppress some of these students, that why you guys went out and took such kind of step. But the debate which evolved around that somehow shows that despite all these denials and lack of opportunity, people did use different methods and means in order to express themselves. And finally, the last one is Nowruz. So most of you may remember that how Nowruz is increasingly became controversial in Afghanistan, not just based on ethnicity, but primarily based on religion. That some people came forward and said this is religion of Majusi and Zoroastrian, and it's not based on Islam. So two examples, for example, that this is Abdurrahman, he is a proper Muslim and he does not observe Zoroastrianism, and he denies whatever is haram. But to counter this, different civic institutions, for example, Penn Association of Afghanistan and Ruman Qalam, they have also presented counter arguments, also different kind of posters to narrate different phases of Nowruz. One of the key examples was that we have to present such shared values as in a framework of civilizational affair, where these cultural items do not belong to one religion or one ethnicity, rather it's shared across the region between different ethnic groups. And that shared heritage will allow us to peacefully coexist with each other. So what at the end I may argue is that all of these mentioned plurality of publics should have provided the possibility for conversations and exchange among individuals of different publics. In other words, plurality demands that different publics interact with one another. But this requires commitment to pluralism, which was somehow missing in Afghanistan. Anyway, so I will stop here, and
you're very on time. Thank you, Sadasar. And the next is Dr. Mujib Obed from University of Melbourne. Floor is yours.
Thank you. I hope you can all hear me. Assalamu alaikum, Bahamagi. It's a privilege to see you all, especially to hear that there are friends of ours in the audience who are joining from Afghanistan. Yeah, look, so my contribution to the edited volume was a chapter titled Unlocking. Oh, Sharifisa, did you say introduce ourselves as well? Sorry.
I agree. I know that's very late for you, and it's probably like 4 o'clock in the morning for you. So my apologies. We completely understand. So feel
No,
free.
no, that's a good, of course.
You want to take your time.
Vale, um, uh, yes, my name is Mujib Abed. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Melbourne. The Initiative for Peace Building is the name of our unit here. And I have a bachelor's from the American University of Afghanistan in political science. So, you know, in a lot of these conferences, I meet faculty, current faculty from AAF, which is always lovely. I then have a master's from Sydney Uni in Peace and Conflict Studies, and have done my PhD at University of Queensland. And my PhD thesis explored the politics of modernist power and politics of resistance in modern Afghan history, essentially. I attempt to theorize, you know, enactments of modernist power since the colonial encounter, making my way all the way to the war on terror and the post 9/11 Afghanistan. And so this chapter that Anna Larson, Omar Sharifi, and Dipali were very kind, and their you know, their imprints are all over this as they helped edit and support me in putting together this chapter and getting it to the finish line. It is very much you know, a continuation of my ongoing interests in relation to Afghanistan. And yet also, as Anna mentioned there earlier, it is also, I think it captures a certain anxiety that we all were sensing and grappling with, a moment of reckoning in a way. And of course, it hasn't gone anywhere, right? But when I wrote this paper, or when I wrote its initial draft, it was, you know, very much immediately after August 21. So I think some of those anxieties are present now that I've revisit the chapter and read it a little more closely after a while. And there is room, certainly I'm self-aware, I suppose, reading it, to, you know, to push some of the nodes of the argument, and see where things stand now, a little while after, since the analysis kind of, my lens stopped observing. Anyway, so the chapter Unlocking the Taliban Puzzle, Traditions and Fundamentalism. So I do a couple of things here, or I try to do, right? So I say that first we need to treat Taliban as a theoretical phenomenon. It can't be this sort of aberration, this exceptional moment, or this exceptional political turn that has no place in Afghanistan's post-colonial historical chronologies. I mean, to me, that doesn't help us at all. We have to attempt to locate the Taliban within a broader post-colonial historical chronologies of Afghanistan, specifically within the trajectories of Afghans themselves experimenting with nationalist ideas, right? So to me, you know, throughout the 20th century and then into the first, you know, two and a half decades of the 21st century, Afghanistan has been the site of these intense, unfortunately, often violent contestations over what the imaginaries of post-colonial, you know, Afghanistan Afghan society and state should be or should contain, and so Taliban is very much part of that chronology. So I kind of, to set up the argument, I do two things. On the one hand, there is the historical kind of setting of the timeline, if you may. And so in the chapter, I go on to discuss, Afghan nationalism, the different expressions that, or different forms and expressions that it takes in the post-colonial period or since independence, let's say since 1919, whether it is young Afghans, wishes Ilmiyan, or, how then some of those ideas around Afghan modernism then gives rise to, a fundamentalist Islam on the one hand, and fundamentalist version or articulation of Marxian politics on the other hand, and within that pantheon is there, of course, liberalism as well. So I paint this. I attempt to paint this picture whereby I say that these different ideological projects, in their own ways, have all tried to graft Islam onto a state form, but of course they do it from different registers. But Islam is always this kind of this ever-present category. It's just that their interpretations of Islam are quite distinct. So on the one hand, that's important, right? Because an analysis, academic or scholarly treatments of Afghanistan, I mean, historical amnesia is something that we all have to deal with. I mean, and there's a lot of reasons why that tends to happen or has tended to happen. But we have got to deal with that, I think, head on. We have to be able to locate our analysis within a certain geo-historical locale, right? So that's what's happening. On the other hand, there is the theoretical debates underlying what's going on. So Taliban as a phenomenon, as a political organization or as a movement, or now as a state, masquerading as a state, or a state indeed. Theoretically, how do we how do we go about it? So well, one can look at it. There are these questions we can ask: Are Taliban, or the Salafist or Wahhabist movement, or they some form of a peasant movement, or they some a student movement? What's going on? But I think one way to look at it that I think is a little more helpful is to ask whether the Taliban are a modernist movement or a traditional movement, right? And there is a lot of reprieve in staying with that question, I think. So I, in the paper, use Sayyid Hossein Nasr's sort of typology of political Islam. So to Nasr, political Islam could be categorized into one of three. There's a triad that he paints. So we have modernist Islam, we have fundamentalist Islam, and we have traditional Islam. And he goes on to say that often from a Western perspective, political Islam is seen as a binary of either a moderate Islam or fundamentalist Islam, right? So a favored moderate Islam, which is what basically it's Islamic modernism that goes back to the colonial period, or a detested fundamentalist Islam. But Nasser says, well, hang on a minute, that's a bit problematic, because we are just wholly abandoning or deliberately erasing another form of political Islam, that is traditional Islam, whereby we are not just looking to the exteriority of religion and faith, but this esoteric turn of Islam, and unpopular customs, and localized attempts at organization, negotiation of power and organization of society, right? Socialization of power. he goes on to locate that. Of course, that's just his body of work is all about championing this traditionalist Islam, right? In tasawwuf, in irfan, in ma'rifah, in Islamic art, Islamic philosophy, Islam, a plurality of views and perspectives and epistemologies within Islamic history. So he just goes on to sort of champion that. And I say that it's important to look at Taliban vis-a-vis in relation to this triad, right? This triumvirate. And the conclusion that I draw is basically, and this is the dilemma that lies at the heart of the Taliban and a lot of the decisions that they make, that's difficult to make sense of, and it comes across as so, frustratingly irrational and self-defeating, even as a movement, if you want to look at it, or try to look at it, the Taliban movement as a rational actor. It's just self-defeating. What's going on? But of course, for the Afghan people and for even the regional countries and global community, it's a big challenge, and it's not always easy to predict the next move when it comes to the Taliban. And of course, has been very violent and repressive as well. So I go on to argue in the paper that within the Taliban, there lies a dilemma. And dilemma is born of the fact that within this triumvirate of political Islams, or just, let's say, Islamic perspectives on politics and society and state, the Taliban disavow one. So they are very much anti what Nasser calls modernist Islam. But then they embrace the other two, and they do it all at once. They do it simultaneously. Within the Taliban, one can find a certain commitment, enduring commitments to fundamentalism. At the same time, there are certain enduring commitments and historical and cultural proximity to traditional Islam. Okay, and this is what creates all this confusion. This is what creates all these contradictions. Hence the difficulty to predict the next move, the difficulty to really map out exactly what the movement is, and so on and so forth. And so within the chapter, then if then one wants to look at the Taliban closely, well, there has to be a framework, or there has to be a certain method to the madness, right? So I then divide, or I then kind of approach it from two perspectives. I look at the Taliban as an insurgency, or as a movement on the rise, and then I look at Taliban as the emirate, right? Either of the versions of the emirate, whether it's late 90s or the post 2021 August 21 iteration of the emirate. So essentially custodians of the state, and at least from my readings, what emerges is that as an insurgency, the Taliban seems to be closer to its traditional sensibilities and Islamic worldviews, and that results in additional or more forms of localization of power, of decentralization, of de-hierarchization, of a less than willingness to embrace the officializing and bureaucratizing and type of almost even territorializing impulses that a modern nation state, or a modern state, I shouldn't call it nation state, a modern state obviously inherently has those impulses, right? It bureaucratizes, it officializes, it expands, it controls and expands territory, right? It's territorializing in that sense. So there's more of an the movement tended to lean more during the insurgency against the Western powers, even in the lead up to taking of Kabul in 1996, and the way it positions itself in the paper I talk about, in the way it positions itself on the one hand in relation to village identity in mid-1990s, and then on the other hand in relation to established Islamist political factions in Hizb Islami and Jamiat Islami, and how it represents itself as champion of some form of an authentic indigenous Islam of Afghans, one that it claims has been dismissed and has been pushed to the margins. And here we are coming back, and this is it's almost like a backlash against that form of modernity that was embodied in political Islam on the one hand, and in Afghan socialism, or just socialism on the other hand. So that's the rise, and then we see it throughout the insurgency as well. There are examples of different consensus and leadership and decision making. Again, at de-hierarchization, right? But then you that the other side of this coin is once they start taking control of the state, and when that happens, because of the contradiction that lies within the dilemma to, on the one hand, stay committed to traditional Afghan sensibilities, whereby the state has had little space, right? It's not an imaginary that gives much attention to, or has a lot of really respect for a modern nation state. So when you want to then hold that knowledge perspective or that worldview simultaneously with the reality, everyday reality of having to manage a state, having to govern through the mechanics of a modern nation state, we then see increasingly Taliban turn inwards. I think the sentence that I used somewhere there is that they abandon a commitment towards native priorities once they control the state for an exclusionary form of nativism. So increasingly we see Taliban turn nativist, and what that means is an inward-looking and a willingness to submit to the power of the supreme, so autocracy, and obviously increasingly repressive policies, decree-based governance, and there's a bunch of other things I mentioned, but there's one discussion that maybe is worth mentioning, and then I'll stop at this, and it has to do with constitution. And so there I tried to juxtapose some conversations that were there in the 90s, in 98 and onwards, around the adoption of a constitution, and there is this sort of phantom document that supposedly was in existence. There was a constitution supposedly, but was never made public because the regime fall. And then in 2005, there's supposed to have been, the terms of which was confirmed, and some of which was communicated to the fighters through the Laiha, the famous Laiha, that the Taliban wrote and circulated amongst its fighters. And then where we are after 21, where initially there was some chatter, some murmurings of internal conversations, at least around the constitution, but then that seems to be now just brushed aside. Sharia is superimposed on, and is supposed to have taken over entirely, such that there is no room for any other form of a foundational document to the current iteration of the emirate. But then I go on to say that there is a certain tension within the Taliban. So, and that I kind of speculate what might be causing this this hesitance to go all the way towards embracing this this debate around the need for a constitution, and why it might not be so keen on drafting one, even though, of course, without it, it's very difficult things have to think that there's yeah, that. So look, I guess I'll leave it at that. Maybe the last point is, speaking of Taliban in these terms is important because we can't give him totality, right? We can't. Maybe there's a claim within the movement for, sort of this. If you listen to the movement and its ideologues, of course the Taliban has absolute power in Afghanistan. There's a totality, or there's a totalizing impulse within its ideological prism, and that's just the fact of life. But I think we have to poke holes within its within its outlook, within its project, because it's this ambivalence within the movement would then allow for resistance, with dissent, whether it's discursive or whether it's resistance in other forms, in more material or embodied forms. There's no power that is absolute. And Taliban is not an exception by any stretch of the imagination. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much once again. I'm sorry if I don't have slides to guide you as well, but thank you very much for this opportunity to once again talk about this paper. And to the editors, thank you for your excellent work and bringing us together and putting together this wonderful collection.
Thank you very much. That was wonderful. So I think we have around, maybe, I'm trying to stretch the limits, maybe 15 minutes for Q&A. So please go ahead, ask questions.
Thank you all for your presentations, and I've already cited things from this book, so it's phenomenal. My question is for Dr. Seven. So this notion of deliberative democracy and pluralism is a fascinating connection, right? Because it operationalizes pluralism. I'm curious, and I'm thinking of various constitutional design processes like in Chile and all of this, which were heavily deliberative, but ultimately didn't work out for a variety of reasons, not just, but just in terms of this. There was not a connection between the deliberation and the outcome. Right. So there was a lot of talking and a lot of people were talking, but it wasn't systematized. And so what happened is then they would just start the process over again. So it iterated like two or three times, I think, 3 phases. And then it ultimately led to something that wasn't useful. Right. And then it fell into far right hands because people were so tired of the process. So all of this to say, I'm curious kind of your thoughts on how would you systematize deliberation, and especially when you mention things like reconciling power imbalances. How might that work in particularly in Afghanistan?
I think maybe you can ask quite a few questions and then is there any other questions?
Yeah, I have deliberations. What?
So please.
No, I just wanted to add
Okay.
something, not just deliberation about what, for what, to what end. The talking, there's a lot of, but this has to be some kind of vision, some kind of something that is the end result or intended.
So maybe I should ask a question. Okay, I want to ask a question for him, and then I start with you and finish with. Would you? Can you hear us? Are you there?
Yes, still here.
All right. I want to make sure you don't fall asleep. Sorry. So actually, the way you talked about discussion about the triad of modernism and fundamentalism and traditionalism, actually it kind of touched upon my own work in Mazar Sharif, in which actually I came across this hot debate in Mazar Sharif about what is modern Islam and what is traditional Islam. And the way it was actually the Taliban was presented, this whole idea of the Taliban, in the minds of a lot of people, the Taliban was seen as much more of a modern version of Islam because while it claims historicity, it claims going back to the origin, but fundamentally the techniques, the mechanism, the technology that they use, and the behavior they actually enact sometimes at least reminds a lot of people of what at least did when they claimed to be the pure communists. And so there's two, and for them, the Khalqis represented are this extreme faction within the PDPA that represented a version of like modernism that was destructive, and Taliban kind of version of Islam as modernist, as kind of a modernist movement that actually is as destructive as the other one. And I'm simplifying it, obviously, about the whole dichotomy of it. And that they claim on the idea of we are the traditional, but the traditionality itself was defined through historicity, through something that has a genealogy, that connects with both architecture, art, and more important, literature. When you say Taliban claim traditionalism or Afghan traditionalism, where that is situated, I would like to, if you, after said, and then you can actually think where, when you discuss this traditionalism, where do you situate that when you talk in the context of Taliban and tolerance? So I think that was my question. Satisfied?
Sure. I'm not particularly aware of the case of Chile that you highlighted, but definitely what was missing in Afghanistan was the same issue, that we were not able to develop certain institutional arrangements. First of all, enable deliberation at the local or national level, and then systematize it in a way that it should lead to a tangible and enforceable outcomes. First of all, there was no belief in deliberation. For instance, in case of the Constitution of Afghanistan, which was negotiated around 2003 and 2004. The number of days that it was provided for the people was quite tight and limited. And there was a survey at the national level to collect the opinion of the people about the political system that they want. But at the end of the day, that survey was put under the table and it was not brought over. So the entire process was just wrapped up in around 2 months. While you had other successful democracies, at least before Modi, India, where the constitution was debated and discussed over a long period of time. Or in case of Israel, where they could not resolve these contentions over rule of religion, and then they agreed that, okay, certain cases that we do not agree, we will postpone it to the future, and certain others, we will remain it ambiguous. So those are two principles that some of these controversial societies may agree. So at this time, for example, even now, Israeli society is highly polarized over between those conservatives who wants to institute a very religious Jewish state, and those who are secular, but they don't have constitution. Now, in Afghanistan, there were at the local level, all the institutions which enabled people to discuss and deliberate, they were disempowered in a way that, let's say, the community councils. How much community councils had authority over the curricula and resources for local schools, let's say? None, right? Certain things were developed for the National Solidarity Program, but assessment shows that discussions over plurality and the way they were accommodative enough to diversity of opinions were not successful. And the same is with India, for example. Scholars have discussed in India to what extent development projects which are brought to people and designed by the people at the local level, they have not been able to mitigate the inequalities. So there's a hierarchical society with caste system excluding so many people, but yes, projects are designed by people, implemented by people, and certainly quite successful, but they have not been able to address those inequalities. Those who are marginalized, how we ensure that they should take part. Now, theoretically, there's one solution, that Tilly says, and the democracy and the problem at the intersection of inequality and democracy. He suggests that as far as day-to-day differences are not translated into categorical differences, and that they are not pushed into the politics, we are fine with inequalities or differences. What do we mean? For example, now we speak different languages, or we may believe in different form of morality or religion. That's our day-to-day disagreements. But if we categorize it like, well, you are X ethnic group and you're Y, and these two columns are fundamental disagreements that you have, and hence you deserve X quota in politics and you deserve Y. That happened in Afghanistan. The worst diagnosis for Afghanistan was to design the political system based on ethnicity. Two vice presidents deliberately designed in order to distribute power across ethnic lines. that should have not happened. I'm sure it should not happen in the future post-Taliban.
But there was the distribution.
There was,
It's
but
just-
on paper, this was the case, right? Yeah.
You have a question?
Yes. I was wondering, if anyone in the room wants to answer, whether they view the UN sort of floating a remotely run Afghanistan or sort of a seat, a female seat at the table of the UN, a sort of remotely run Afghanistan. I was just wondering, if that was a subject of the book and the study, if that sort of development came after later, or even opinions, tangents.
You mean in the book, the authorship of the authors in the book?
Yeah, even.
Anna, do you want to answer that? Anna, are you there?
Yep, I'm here. Just a second.
All right.
I'm here. Just a second. Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So that had not been floated at the time we were writing the book. I think it's very difficult when we talk about authority. We talk about it in terms of a power that is recognized. So, drawing from a number of different scholars who have defined power and authority separately over the many different disciplines that we draw on in the book, we separate them by saying power can be imposed, it can be hard, it can be soft, but it can be separated from authority because authority requires recognition from the ground up. It requires recognition and acquiescence from those who are being governed. And then it also requires recognition from outside as well. And so that's how we choose to define authority in the book. And I feel like if you had somebody who was representing Afghanistan from that had recognition from outside, you would certainly need a groundswell of support, not only from diaspora, but also from those inside Afghanistan who then acquiesce to being represented in that way, I think, in order for that person to hold authority. But I'm really interested in the idea and would be interested in others' thoughts in the room as well.
In Afghanistan, at least the last 20 years, there was not one center of power or authority. There were 4 parallel centers. There was the United States with its army, ambassador, and everything else. There was the United Nations with its own security force and money and budget and everything else. There were the NGOs that were also, having their own security, their own money, their own projects. And then the weakest of them was the Kabul government. And that also, so I mean, we're talking about where power and where authority, especially in the case, at least the 20 years of the so-called republic. These are a bit more complex than I think theories are suggesting.
I think if I can suggest something like a recent writings of Ollie on Syria, she touches on the question of the precarious societies. I understand by looking at the whole case of Afghanistan Syria, and also this whole international convention, the whole question of women's rights, and I'm trying to kind of put it in a framework like your question. How we have from approach that from, as Ustad says, from understanding that there was a precarious, very shaky kind of sovereignty, and within the limited sovereignty, how much you can do. I think that kind of might be helpful. So please, I would be happy to share with you the readings and stuff after. All right. Would you say if you have if you're ready, one answer?
Yeah. So just I'll keep it brief. But look, so in my work in general, coloniality of power, the legacies of colonialism in Afghanistan, and its continued salience. it casts a long shadow. And so the way I see it, and I like to think that the way Nasser sees it, he's very conscious of the colonial encounters and the disruptions and trauma associated with it, but at the same time, transformative potential that it harbored and continues to harbor. I mean, for me, it's very difficult to look at the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the ideological experimentations that underpinned it, or the American and Western invasion and occupation and the ideological liberal experimentations that underpinned it, and not see it in a long durée sort of tradition, as you put it, Sharif said, of historicity of encounters with colonialism. So in that sense, Islamic modernism emerges out of the colonial context, whether it's the Levant, whether it is Ottoman Empire and its interactions and encounters and its own sort of imperial ambitions and how it views modernity to promote that particular project, or whether it is the subcontinent where we have, while we have Deobandism rising as this revivalist movement, for example, in a very critical moment in 19th century, revivalist movement of Islam, and that does it through a type of embrace of the inner world and meanings of Islam, to inward looking, a type of a voluntary disengagement from the politics in the state form. We have this, right, on the one hand, where intuition and in a type of gnoseology comes to replace your Western epistemology, which is production of knowledge through the scientific method, right? We also have, so that's, to me, that's traditional Islam. But we also have the likes of Sir Sayyid Ahmad, who just basically espouses modernist Islam, says that, for example, I mean, some of the work that he has done on viewing the Quran and the Bible as somehow being a lot more closely and doing it deliberately to exclude Hindus, and how Sir Sayyid Ahmad and people from his ilk will have like an enduring influence on nationalist Muslim imaginaries in our parts of the world. I'm saying that because I want us to be aware that the triad of political modernist political Islam, fundamentalist political Islam, or traditional Islam, they cannot be understood in isolation. They have to be understood within the context of the colonial encounter. And in Afghanistan, I think modernist political Islam have seen expression through the socialist lens. It has seen expression through the liberal lens, through monarchist lens. Fundamentalist Islam, we all know about it. Jihad is very much at the center of it. But also, but then there's traditional Islam, which has been under attack, just like the traditional society. The backward parochial Afghan society supposedly has been under attack for a long time. I mean, this is colonialism didn't just happen. Alongside it came modernity, right? The civilizing mission came right alongside it. So for a long time, people of the global South, we're looking at Afghanistan, people of Afghanistan, the traditional Afghan society has been under attack. It has been staring straight at the nozzle of this rifle pointed straight at it, demanding assimilation. And I think we have to explore that more. I do not believe that we have explored that enough. We're too keen to just embrace the modernist project as something that is inherently good, and that necessarily hasn't proven to be the case. But look, this is a very long-winded way of saying, Sharif said, that at least I see it in relation to colonialism and on coloniality of power. And coloniality of power, I think, is a powerful framework that we can't necessarily afford to give up on in trying to explain and then hopefully imagine, productively so, better alternative futures for our country.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we don't have more time in the future. We'll have to jump to another panel. But for our panelists, for the participants, both here and those from Afghanistan, thank you and a big applause. Thank you again. Have a wonderful night. For those who are Afghanistan, I think it starts at 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock. And for producer for YouTube. For the office. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.